Okay, guys, here's our. Oh, I gotta write the summary. One moment. Okay, sorry about that. Now, let's get into our final video for the week. So, this is about the practices and effects of World War One. Get over there. So, here's our terms. We do have more than 10 terms this time. So, I'm going to move on to the next one in a second. Okay, here I go. I think there's one more. Yep. Okay. And then let's get into this. Okay. So, World War One is when industrializations. We don't see many wars, especially at this scale, among industrial states up until World War One. That even like wars between industrialized states, like you could say, like the American Civil War had elements to that, but the South was not necessarily an industrial state. They couldn't produce a lot of their weapons. They had the population in many ways of an industrial state, though. So, like, these are industrial states fighting each other and leveraging the resources available to them to fight this war. The first kind of element of this is that these nations now have the power of mass media. They have so much more direct authority and power over their populations. Police forces are more effective, right, at like controlling mass internal problems. Like, policing isn't great. We got talking about problems with urbanization, but like in terms of like a state being able to influence and shape their population, no state had the power that these industrial states had going into the 20th century at that point. And eventually they had to turn to conscription, where the state knows who you are, knows how many people it has, and then can raise a levy in the millions of people to fight for the state's interest, right? Now, what's interesting is that at first, in the first year of the war, there is a very enthusiastic population that's willing to participate in the war without being coerced. That's primarily because the male populations of these nations have been inundated with nationalism, had been prepared through public schooling systems to fight for their nation. And so when the war begins, many young men are ready and able to go to prove the greatness of their nation, to experience the adventure of the military and fighting and things like that. But when we get to fighting there's nothing romantic about World War I. And AMSCO's bias is really towards the Western Front. So that's all we're going to talk about. There's a lot of different fronts of World War I. Not all of them. Actually, this is the only one that's like this, but it's still very distinct and will help you understand the war. Okay? So, the Western Front, it was a relatively small front in the war compared to everywhere else the war is fought. It pretty much, the Western Front was from the Alps in Central Europe, Switzerland, all the way up to the English Channel. And compared to like Russia or all of the Middle East, that's tiny. And what you kind of have is a bottleneck that gets created that's going to encourage defensive warfare. And one of the key defensive tools available to both sides is the construction of trenches. This massive network of trenches spans from the Swiss Alps up to the English Channel. They run parallel to each other. They try to dig around and outflank each other, but eventually they dig these tunnels or these pits, these long trenches along Europe, along Western Europe. And why do they do that? Well, first of all, it gives them a great deal of a defensive protection, right? Because you can hide in the trench, you can station snipers, you can put machine guns, you can be protected from artillery that now can be fired from miles away at a scale that was unheard of 40 years ago. And so what that means is any offensive action is going against an entrenched enemy that had the ability to fight you, defend their position better than you had to attack that position. So any type of offensive action was extremely costly in terms of casualties, but also did not gain much territory because of how much you had to fight for it. And what this did was it led to a stalemate. it led to a period of time where little progress was made on either side of the war. But the static nature of the war led to the development and use of technologies in different ways. So one kind of psychologically traumatic but ultimately unimportant technology is poison gas. Because these soldiers are in these trenches and they can't leave the trenches, you can drop all manner of awful things on them, including gas that, when inhaled, would incinerate their lungs, right? It would liquefy their lungs and like tear them apart from the inside, right? Oftentimes, it would not have the effect that was intended, especially after gas masks became common issue on the front. But the first time it was used was extremely impactful, right? Because people had to flee the trenches. They were left unoccupied. Germans with gas masks were able to advance to the trenches and occupy those trenches. Now, the more significant, probably the weapon that's responsible for the most deaths almost in human history, but not quite, would be the machine gun. And at this point in history, the machine gun was a heavy weapon. You could not carry a machine gun with you into an offensive action. They were so heavy you'd be dragging them along, or you'd be moving so slowly, you'd be a sitting duck and shot down almost immediately when you're crossing the area between the trenches known as no man's land. So machine guns could only be used defensively, and a machine gun fires bullets at a very high rate. They fire bullets so quickly that they would make the barrel so hot that if you didn't find some way of cooling it, the barrel would literally melt or warp. So you have to have water jackets that would circulate water and cool the barrel. You have those little holes that are have the air that are air-cooled machine guns, which become more common later on. But you don't have submachine guns yet. You don't have small machine guns a person can carry until near the end of the war, which means that if you're attacking, you're going into someone who can fire 500 bullets a minute, where with you and your little bolt-action rifle, you're only firing 5 bullets, a clip and reloading. So maybe you can get like 20, 30 bullets out a minute. They're firing 500 of them a minute. Submarines are a new technology. It's a vessel that can submerge underwater, and it was mainly used by the Germans to target shipping. Airplanes had a lot of potential, but essentially they were a giant wooden box that were pulled through the air by their own propellers. They really were not used to hold. They couldn't carry a lot of weight. So often they were used to fly over enemy positions, take little pictures, maybe draw us what's going on, give some reconnaissance. And then the final piece of technology that's still influential today would be the tank, which was an armored vehicle that was intended to be used to break the stalemate, because people could hide behind the tank. It could bring cannons with them and then shoot the positions and give coverage to soldiers advancing on trenches. However, tanks their potential is not realized during World War I, but during World War II, they are used by very broad ways by militaries. The U.S. enters the war in 1917, so they're only in the war for about a year, maybe a year and a half. The main reason why they joined the war is the blockade of Germany by Great Britain. So Great Britain has the biggest navy in the world. Germany has a very limited coastline, so they are chilling on this coastline, then not stopping anything from getting into Germany. Germany has chosen to declare war on all the nations it buys its food from, like Russia and France. And so there's a lot of food insecurity that's going on inside of Germany during this time. But because American merchants can't sell to Germany, even though they'd like to, they got to sell their goods. And so they choose to sell their goods to Great Britain instead, which inadvertently is supporting the British war effort and the British blockade of Germany, which means that Germany says that justifies their choice to then target American shipping with submarines using torpedoes and stuff like that. Americans are not happy that they're non-combatants. They're not in the war yet. And in fact, most Americans do not support joining the war until around 1917. And the catalyst, the moment that really changes, really ignites fervor and a furor against the Germans would be the sinking of the British passenger liner, the Lusitania, that was carrying some weapons as well, but had American passengers on board, and about 100 Americans died when the Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat. So that was making Americans mad. The next thing that made Americans mad was the leaking of the Zimmerman telegram by Great Britain, which essentially was the German foreign secretary sent a little message to Mexico and said, hey, Mexico, if you help us deal with America, we will give you back the parts of Mexico you lost in the Mexican-American War in 1848. And now Americans are like, you want Mexico to fight us? We're mad at you. And so they support intervention. America declares war on Germany. One novelty and significant moment of the war, or a development of war, is the concept of total war. Total war is when a state exerts every resource at its disposal, human resources, natural resources, political resources, or economic resources, towards the war effort, right? This is often done when the state perceives that the war represents an existential struggle for the state, that if the state fails to win the war, the state will cease to exist. And so everything a citizen does is interpreted in the context of a war. So like, if you are buying too much butter at the store and hoarding butter, you are disrupting the war effort because all the other people in the country are going to get mad because they don't have butter, and that's going to like make the workers less productive. So you need to make sure you don't take too much butter, right? So nations institute rationing, where you are only allowed to buy a certain amount of goods. People are told to, with the industrial capacity of the nation, the industrial capacity of the nation is turning what was making vehicles or making clothing into making like parachutes or tanks or armored vehicles, right? So domestic industry becomes military industry and all of that. And a really important thing about total war is that when this occurs, the line between a combatant and a civilian are blurred, because if a factory worker is making a gun that will kill your soldiers, attacking a factory in some interpretations is a valid military target, though that civilian has not fired or is not trying to kill you directly, right? And then states have access to these use propaganda and mass media to warp civilian perceptions of the war. No one gets an honest call on for the entirety of the war. Specifically, like a good example would be the German population. When the German military announces in 1918 that they literally cannot fight the war anymore, they have run out of like soldiers to do so. The German population's like, what? We were told we were winning this war like the entire time, and like you just said we were out of soldiers. What do you mean? Like that's what was going on with propaganda during World War I. World War I was a global war, which means that it happened everywhere, right? AMSCO claims that like the 7 Years' War was like the last World War. like even throughout the Napoleonic Wars, you have conflict happening across the world, mainly in like the seas, but like you have global conflict throughout. But in World War I, you have fighting in Asia, fighting in Africa and Europe and the oceans, but also participants because of the fact that these European empires controlled so much of the world's area. People from Africa fought in Europe. People from North America fought in Europe. People from Asia fought in Europe as well. They spent some time talking about the Middle Eastern Front, which is a whole, again, guys, I can say a lot about this, but we'll talk a little bit about this. The Ottoman Empire is fighting against the British and the French for the most part, and the Russians to a minimal extent. The Ottomans are believed to be like the wusses of the war, the weakest country. So the British and the French are like, oh, we'll beat them easy. And then the Ottomans actually fight this war relatively effectively. They have a lot of success at the Battle of Gallipoli, which is a peninsula in Anatolia. The British use soldiers from Australia and New Zealand. That's the Australia-New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC. And Gallipoli, the Ottomans win the Battle of Gallipoli. It's an immensely bloody battle. Hundreds of thousands of casualties in this battle. It happens over about an 8-month period. The problem with the Ottoman Empire during this war is that it is a non-industrial state forced to fight an industrial war. So it is scraping the bottom of the barrel of its resources, trying to fight this war, and it simply doesn't have the economic capacity to do so. And then also one of the largest contingents of people who fight for the British during World War I in the Middle East are Indians who fight in the Eastern campaigns in like modern day Iraq. And then the British also convince Arabs to revolt against the Ottomans, and they fight an informal guerrilla war against the Ottomans. Because a lot of men are now being sent to fight overseas or fight in the war, there is now a scarcity of masculine labor inside of a country, which means they needed to fill that need for labor, which means that groups that historically had not been preferred for those jobs were now being preferred, namely women, right? So women were not preferred to work in the factories, like military factories, heavy industry factories, steel factories. Now that men were not available to do so, women were encouraged and did make an effort to participate in industrial labor. And the war concludes with the Paris Peace Conference. The German Empire collapses in 1918 when the military ceases to be able to fight the war. There is a revolution in Germany, the German Revolution. The Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, is forced to flee. A democracy is put into place known as the Weimar Republic, because Weimar was where it was founded. Now, the Weimar government this war was not our problem. Like, this was a consequence of the Kaiser's policies. So we will choose to engage in negotiations. It was not an unconditional surrender, but it was a surrender in which the Entente had more leverage than the Germans, okay? So what's important about that is that the Entente believed that they could impose their demands however they saw fit, while the Weimar government believed that they should not be punished for the actions of a government that had just been overthrown. Okay, so that's the complex nature of the Paris Peace Conference. They have AMSCO deigns to name the leaders of these nations. The president of the United States at the time is a man named Woodrow Wilson. David Lloyd George is the leader of Great Britain. Georges Clemenceau is the leader of France, and Vittorio Orlando is the leader of Italy. Right, and these are the four nations that had the biggest influence in shaping the post-World War I world. And the intent is to create a world that would not guarantee a future conflict of the scale of World War I, which is so funny when you know what's going to happen next. It's not funny, but what's important about these big four is that all of them had different interests that were not in concert with each other. Woodrow Wilson sought to reshape a world that the American economy and political system could benefit from. The British believed that they wanted to have a less harsh peace that made sure that Germany was not a threat in the future. France was pedal to the metal on punishing Germany, and Italy sought to become more powerful in the power vacuums created by the defeated Central Powers, like in the Ottoman Empire, like in Austria-Hungary and Germany. So Wilson had these 14 points that were supposed to guarantee peace. As a child, I thought they were really good. In the end, they are very idealistic. They talk about one of the most important precepts is they call for self-determination. The problem with the 14 points and their implementation is that Woodrow Wilson believed that America had a right to shape the world after World War I, and everyone else who had fought the other 3 years of the war were kind of like, you just showed up, why should you have a say in the war, right? One of the key parts of the League of 14 points is it calls for a League of Nations, where the nations of the world can meet together and solve their problems through discussion, not through military conflict. The one issues and ironies is that despite America insisting on the creation of a League of Nations, America does not join the League because the American Senate and House do not ratify the Treaty of Versailles because they don't want to be entangled in another war, which I guess makes sense. And then another important hypocrisy of the 14 points is that Woodrow Wilson calls for the self-determination of all peoples but is very much not thinking about the subject peoples of these European empires, but in fact talking about the peoples of Europe, right? So white people can determine their own government, but not Africans, not Asians, and things like that. The ultimate document that comes out of the Paris Peace Conference is known as the Treaty of Versailles. There are two other treaties that come out of the post-war period that are insignificant. The Treaty of Trianon deals with Austria-Hungary, and the Treaty of Sèvres deals with the Ottoman Empire. But the Versailles is rather harsh towards Germany, especially where the Weimar government was like, we're not even that Germany anymore. Why are you doing this? Germany is forced to pay reparations for the damages caused to France and Great Britain as a consequence of the war. Inside of Germany, the Weimar government is blamed for causing this harsh treaty. So the Weimar government's legitimacy is hit from the beginning. And just democracy is always on a shaky grounds in Germany throughout the 1920s and 30s. Well, they stopped becoming a democracy early in the 30s when Hitler comes to power. But yeah, so that's the Treaty of Versailles. So you'll guys see me next week, but it'll be 2020 me, 2021 me, not 2023 me. And I will see you guys in a few weeks. Bye, guys.